I was 11 years old the night I stood barefoot on the cold linoleum of our colony kitchen, listening to my mother cry so quietly that I almost mistook it for the wind pressing against the window screens. My brother Eli was 14, and he had done something that, in the outside world, would have earned him nothing more than a tired sigh from a parent, but in our world, on our Hutterite colony, it was enough to bring 3 of the elders to our door before the sun came up. I remember the smell of the kitchen that night, yeast and wood smoke and the particular mineral smell of well water left too long in a metal cup, and I remember thinking, even at 11, that some silences are heavier than any shouting could ever be. Eli had been caught with a small transistor radio, hidden under a loose floorboard in the boys' dormitory, and worse than the radio itself was who had given it to him. A Mennonite boy from a farm supply store 2 hours away. A boy Eli had befriended during one of our community's rare trips into town to sell produce. That friendship was the real violation, not the radio. The radio was just the evidence. I want you to understand something before I go further, because I think it matters more than anything else I could tell you tonight. In a colony, you are never disciplined alone. A colony is not a house with 4 walls and a family inside it. It is more like a single body, and every person is a hand or a foot or a rib of that body, and when one part of the body reaches somewhere it isn't supposed to reach, the whole body feels it. That is not a metaphor I made up as an adult trying to sound wise. That is what it felt like, standing in that kitchen at 11 years old, feeling the whole colony's attention pressing down on our house like the weather. The elders didn't yell. That's the part people never expect when I tell this story. There was no red-faced shouting, no slamming of doors. There was a terrible, deliberate calm, 3 men in dark vests sitting at our table with their hats in their laps, speaking in low German dialect to my father while my mother stood at the stove not cooking anything, just holding the handle of a pot like it was the only solid thing left in the room. Have you ever been in a room where everyone was being polite and you still felt like the walls were closing in? Tell me in the comments, because I think that feeling, quiet dread dressed up as calm, is something almost nobody talks about, and I think a lot of you have felt it in your own families, in your own kitchens, even outside of any colony at all. Eli was brought in. He stood in the doorway in his stocking feet, his suspenders hanging loose because he'd been pulled straight from bed. And I remember his face wasn't scared so much as it was ashamed, which is a very different thing, and a much heavier one. Shame doesn't need anyone to raise their voice. Shame just needs eyes. The discipline itself, when it came, was not violent in the way outsiders sometimes imagine. There was no beating, no dramatic punishment scene. What happened was this. Eli was told he would not eat at the communal table with the rest of the colony for 2 weeks. He would eat alone, standing, in the kitchen, after everyone else had finished. He would not be spoken to directly by the men of the colony unless it was work-related instruction. And the radio, along with any letters he had received from his Mennonite friend, would be burned in the wood stove, in front of him, that same night. I watched my brother's face while my father fed those folded letters into the fire one at a time, and I want to tell you that I have never forgotten the particular orange light it threw across his cheekbones, the way it made him look older and younger at the same time, the way his jaw worked but no sound came out of his mouth. Some punishments leave marks you can see. This one left a mark you could only hear, in how quiet Eli became for the rest of that winter. If you've made it this far with me, I want to ask you something, gently, before we go on. This channel exists because so many of you have written to me, Amish, Mennonite, Hutterite, and people who left all 3, saying you'd never heard anyone tell these stories from the inside, with care instead of spectacle. If a story like Eli's, about the quiet cost of curiosity, about a boy punished for reaching toward a friendship across community lines, means something to you, I'd ask you to subscribe now, because there are more stories like this one waiting, and they deserve an audience that listens with the same respect I'm trying to tell them with. What almost nobody understands, unless they've lived it, is that the 2 weeks of silence weren't really the punishment. The punishment was watching the community slowly, carefully, decide whether Eli could be trusted again. Trust, in a colony, is not given back all at once. It is measured out in small tasks, whether you're allowed to help with the milking rotation unsupervised, whether an elder lets you carry the mail without someone walking beside you, whether the younger children are still permitted to sit near you at the long table. I watched my brother earn back an inch of trust at a time, like a man climbing out of a well using handholds barely wide enough for his fingers. But here is the part of the story that the video's title doesn't quite prepare you for, because it isn't really about Eli's punishment at all. It's about what came after, 3 years later, when Eli was 17 and I was 14, and our family made the decision that would split us in half forever. Our father, who had grown quieter and more troubled since that winter, began meeting privately with a Mennonite minister from the same town where Eli's old friend lived, a soft-spoken man named Brother Yoda who ran a small fellowship that welcomed families in transition, as he called it, families who had grown uneasy with colony life but weren't ready for the wide, frightening openness of the English world outside. I didn't understand at 14 what in transition meant. I only understood that my father had started asking Eli questions at the supper table that no one on our colony would have dared ask out loud. Questions about whether a person's soul needed a colony around it to stay safe, or whether that was something a person could carry on his own. Have you ever watched someone you love start asking questions you weren't ready to hear the answers to? Let me know in the comments, because I think that moment, watching a parent's certainty crack open, is one of the loneliest things a child can witness, no matter what community you grew up in. We left the following spring. Not in secret, not in shame, but not with any grand ceremony either. Just a wagon loaded before dawn. A handful of families who'd chosen the same path standing at the colony gate with folded arms and unreadable faces, watching us go the way you'd watch weather move across a field, something you couldn't stop and weren't sure yet whether to mourn. My mother didn't cry that morning, though I know now that she cried plenty in the weeks after. I think there is a kind of grief that needs privacy before it can even begin. The Mennonite fellowship we joined was, in almost every visible way, gentler than colony life, private property instead of shared, personal bank accounts instead of communal ones, decisions made household by household instead of by colony vote. But gentleness is not the same as ease. I remember the first Sunday service in that small white clapboard church, how strange it felt to sing hymns in English instead of German, how strange it felt that no one checked whether my dress was the correct shade or my kerchief tied the approved way. How that freedom felt less like relief and more like standing on ice you weren't sure would hold your weight. Eli struggled more than any of us. He had spent his adolescence learning, painfully, exactly where every boundary of colony life stood, and now here he was in a community that measured its boundaries so differently that his old instincts were suddenly useless, even embarrassing. I watched him flinch, more than once, when a Mennonite boy his age spoke casually to a girl at a fellowship picnic, some old colony reflex in him expecting a rebuke that never came. I watched him grow suspicious of freedoms other young people in that fellowship had never had to earn. There is a particular kind of loneliness in belonging to two worlds and feeling fully at home in neither. I didn't have language for that at 14. I only had the physical sensation of it, a tightness behind my ribs whenever someone in the new fellowship asked me an innocent question about how things were before, as though my entire childhood were a single simple story instead of a house with many rooms, some of them warm, some of them cold, most of them both at once. The final turn of this story, the part one still find hardest to tell, came 2 years later, when Eli, now 19, received a letter. Not from the Mennonite friend whose friendship had started all of this so many years before, but from a Hutterite colony 3 states away, a distant cousin community connected to ours through my mother's side, offering him a place among them if he wanted to return, fully, to communal Hutterite life, the very structure he had once been punished under, the very structure our family had walked away from. I remember sitting across from him at our kitchen table, a different kitchen now, one with a refrigerator humming in the corner and a calendar from a feed store tacked to the wall, nothing like the colony kitchen of my childhood, watching him read that letter twice, Then a third time, his thumb moving slowly along the folded crease the way our fathers had once moved along those letters before they went into the fire. He asked me, very quietly, whether I thought a person could go back to a life he'd been punished inside of and still call it home. I didn't have an answer for him then. I'm not sure I have one now, at whatever age I am telling you this story from. What Eli chose, and I'll tell you honestly, because this channel only means anything if I'm honest with you, was neither full return nor full departure. He visited that Hutterite colony for a season, working alongside cousins he barely remembered, relearning the rhythms of communal labor and communal silence. And he came back changed, not healed exactly, but steadier, the way a plant looks different after it's been transplanted twice, a little worn at the roots, but alive, and oddly stronger for having survived two different soils. Have you ever gone back to a place, a church, a family, a version of yourself, that once hurt you, just to understand it better? I'd love to hear about that in the comments below, because I think Eli's journey back and forth between two forms of plain life, one Hutterite and one Mennonite, says something true about all of us, that healing rarely moves in one direction, and that sometimes the only way forward really is back through the fire first. I think about that transistor radio sometimes, still. Not because it mattered, it was just cheap plastic and a few wires, forgotten within a year even by the boy who'd given it to Eli, but because of what it revealed, the way a single small object can crack open a much larger question a family didn't know it was ready to ask. Eli's punishment wasn't really about a radio. It was the first thread pulled in a much longer unraveling, one that eventually led our whole family across the invisible, complicated border between two plain worlds that most outsiders assume are nearly identical, but which, I promise you, having lived inside both, are as different from each other as any two countries divided by nothing more than a fence line and a shared, aching history. Eli is older now, with children of his own, raised inside the Mennonite fellowship but taught, deliberately, some of the old Hutterite hymns our grandmother used to hum while kneading bread. He says he wants his children to know both silences, the colony kind and the fellowship kind, so that if they ever have to choose, the way he once did, they'll at least recognize the ground beneath their feet, whichever direction they walk. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever felt caught between two versions of home, two definitions of belonging, two entire ways of understanding what a family owes to a community, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel, because these are the stories I want to keep telling, carefully, one at a time, for as long as people keep trusting me with them. And if you think there's someone in your life who's ever felt torn between where they came from and where they are going, please consider liking this video and sending it their way. Sometimes a story like Eli's is the thing that lets someone else finally say out loud what they've been carrying quietly for years. And before you go, I'd love to know, in the comments, whenever you're ready, has there ever been a moment in your own life where you had to choose between two different versions of home, two different families, two different definitions of who you were supposed to be? I read every single one of your answers, and I promise you, they matter to me more than you know. Thank you for sitting with Eli's story tonight, and with mine. I'll see you in the next one.